This is Germany in 1923. People were actually using banknotes to paper walls and to start fires. The German mark had become worthless. So worthless, people wouldn't even consider using it as toilet paper. Prices were doubling on average every 2 days. The annual inflation rate reached 1.5% times 10 to the 56th power. This is Zimbabwe in 2008. At that time, they printed their most famous banknote. Look, you can't even count all the zeros on it. It was 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. Prices were doubling on average every 24.7 hours. The annual inflation rate reached 7.3% times 10 to the 108th power. Can you imagine that? Well, I can't. And this is Hungary in 1946. Prices were doubling on average every 15.6 hours. And the annual inflation rate? 7.5% times 10 to the 170th power. These might seem like jokes to us now, but at the time, it was an absolute disaster for these economies. In 2022, the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom suddenly experienced a surge in inflation, making it once again a main theme in the global economy. Why does inflation occur? If inflation is so frightening, why do some economists say it's good? It sounds so simple, but why is it so difficult to control? So in this video, let's discuss inflation in a way that's both easy and fun, yet insightful. Inflation refers to the depreciation of money, or that of a currency. The most common measuring indicator is called the CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index. It basically measures the price trends of goods and services that we use regularly. Look, this is the CPI of the United States. 60 years ago, it was around 29, and now it's 296. This absolute number actually doesn't mean much on its own. But when you compare it, you'll understand that the prices in the United States are roughly 10 times what they were 60 years ago. This means that $1 from 60 years ago is approximately equivalent to $10 now. It's lower than what you imagined, right? Let's look at some other countries. Over 60 years, the prices in Australia have increased 16-fold, in the UK 25-fold, in India 88-fold, and in Turkey by 9,700,000 times. Price increases mean that money becomes less and less valuable. But if we want to understand inflation in depth, first we need to look at a formula. You see this C here? Just kidding. How could we talk about such a boring formula? Actually, economists have a plethora of formulas to describe and explain inflation, including Keynesianism, monetarism, neo-Keynesianism, blah blah blah. They all sound reasonable when you listen to them, but none of these are useful over the long term. One of the fascinating aspects about inflation is that because of the way it occurs, it's actually quite simple. It's essentially about the amount of money circulating in an economy being bigger than the size of the economy itself. Too much money chasing too few goods naturally results in price increases. The primary, and in many cases the only objective of central banks in many countries is to maintain price stability. That means no matter how much money you print, or how you adjust the interest rates, the only thing you need to ensure is the stability of prices and control of the inflation rate. But it's in fact hard to maintain. Even institutions like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, which have some of the world's top economists, often have internal disagreements on how to go about it. So it's actually not as simple as you may think after all. Now let's dive a bit deeper. From the perspective of an entire economy, money is essentially just a tool for circulation. Therefore, the purchasing power that this currency represents, whether my cup of milk tea costs $5 or $50, isn't really the main concern here. So what are we truly pursuing? From the perspective of an economy, what we're really pursuing is higher output, or simply put, higher GDP. This means everyone works hard every day, puts effort into their work, and strives to produce more and better products and services. As consumers, we can then consume and enjoy these better products and services. This way, the entire economy operates more efficiently. This is what we aim for. From the perspective of currency, how can it help us achieve higher output? Normally, we would think that since money is just a tool in the economy, it's best if it remains stable. This means, for example, if you have $100, you should always be able to buy the same amount of goods with it. It's stable and helps the economy run. But gradually, people have discovered that the money in our hands is not completely unchanging. Instead, everyone's money is gradually losing value. It depreciates. So if you hide money under your bed, which might seem like a safe thing, its ability to buy things or its purchasing power slowly diminishes due to inflation. This purchasing power is transferred to the newly created money. It's actually a continuous, subtle adjustment of everyone's wealth. Can't be too comfy. Need to minimize the amount of money I stash under my bed and instead push myself more to earn money, produce, and spend. So we see inflation is actually a constant redistribution of wealth. Fascinating, isn't it? For example, if you buy a cup of milk tea for $5 this year, the same cup will cost you $6 next year. So when you look at the money in your hand, if you don't spend it this year, it will be worth less next year. So it's better to spend more of it now. As a result, people will engage more in immediate consumption. This increases the overall demand in society, leading to a rise in GDP. This is why it is now commonly believed that a moderate amount of inflation is beneficial for the economy as a whole. Of course, as consumers, we definitely don't like this feeling of being forced to spend money. That's why many people have included inflation as something called the misery index. But economists don't really care about this misery index.
I'm here to tell you right now, we don't care.
To them, economic development is more important. Now, what about the opposite situation or deflation of money? Meaning with the same $100, you can buy more next year than this year. If that were the case, I would definitely hide my money under the bed. This way wealth actually increases year by year. Does not sound like misery, right? But the problem is if this happens, people won't be motivated to work hard and earn money. They would just stay at home, and spending would be reduced as much as possible. After all, not spending money is essentially the same as earning money. So everyone would only spend on necessities. In the long term, this can lead to a very dangerous deflationary spiral. Japan is a prime example here. After the bubble burst in the 1990s, Japan fell into deflation. When prices kept dropping, it sounded good at first because my money today will buy more tomorrow. But there was a catch. People started waiting to spend their money, thinking things will be cheaper later. This waiting game meant less money is spent in shops and on services. Businesses then earned less and started cutting costs, laying off workers or stopping new investments. This led to a period of weak credit that lasted for 30 years. Despite the central bank's attempts to stimulate the economy and the government's borrowing, demand just couldn't be stimulated. Of course, there are a series of cultural and aging issues involved, but you can see how terrifying deflation can be. So the real problem isn't just that prices are getting cheaper, it's that everyone stops working, stops trying, stops earning money, and stops producing. Everyone would just lie flat and stop spending money, entering into a low-desire society. This is the deeper problem. We care about inflation not because we're concerned about price changes per se, but because these price changes lead to shifts in demand and GDP. However, the wealth redistribution effect of inflation also shouldn't be too extreme. For example, if the money under my bed can buy 100 cups of milk tea this year, 99 next year, and 98 the year after, you might think that's okay, right? I'll just work hard to earn money. But like in Zimbabwe, if I can buy 100 cups of milk tea today and only 50 tomorrow, and then in a week I can't even afford one cup, that's a problem. Because what's the point of earning money, right? If the game keeps getting reset every few days and everyone's wealth is reshuffled, I've worked hard to earn money and support my family, and you just reset everything. Of course, I'd just give up. As long as I have enough money for my own expenses, that's enough. The money feels like a hot potato in my hands. I have to spend it quickly. Whatever's left, if saved, will soon disappear anyway. This situation is called hyperinflation. It's a severe form of inflation and has a devastating impact on the economy. Take post-World War I Germany, for example. At that time, a loaf of bread cost 100 billion marks, and by the next day, it might have risen to 200 billion. In such a situation, the economy's financial and credit systems were basically paralyzed. The productive capacity of society also plummeted. Within 6 months, Germany had 6 million unemployed people, leading to new currency and military controls, political instability, and even indirectly contributing to Hitler's rise to power. Historically, countries that have fallen into hyperinflation have had to go through difficult and comprehensive reforms and restarts to slowly recover. So as we just discussed, deflation is like the economy being frozen. It stops developing and freezes to death. On the other hand, hyperinflation is like the economy overheating and starting to self-combust. It gets worse as it continues to burn. Neither of these is good. So now that we've discussed both deflation and hyperinflation, we can understand more deeply why most economists pursue a moderate level of inflation. For example, countries like the United States, Europe, the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, and Australia have set their inflation targets around 2 to 3%. Most other economies' central banks, although they might not announce a specific inflation target, also aim to keep inflation within a range of 2 to 5%. No matter what monetary policy they use, the number one goal of these central banks is to maintain inflation within a reasonable range, even if it means sacrificing some short-term economic growth. By the way, some might be curious about how inflation affects asset prices, like stock and housing prices. And no, this is not financial advice. Theoretically, it's difficult to say precisely because there are many interfering factors. But if you were to intuitively guess a direction, you might think it's positively correlated. Because prices rise during inflation, people might invest in real estate and the stock market to hedge against inflation. But interestingly, when we look at the IMF's regression analysis of the relationship between stock prices and inflation in 71 economies, we won't go into details of this chart, the conclusion is that whether in developed or developing countries, the performance of stock prices is actually negatively correlated with inflation. That means when inflation is high, stocks generally tend to fall. This is mainly because policy changes, either fiscal or monetary, are the key factors driving stock prices down. During periods of high inflation, governments and central banks are likely to adopt contractionary policies to curb inflation. In other words, they reduce the money supply and decrease economic activity. These contradictory policies lead to a fall in stock prices. Turkey is an exception here. It didn't adopt contractionary policies during a period of high inflation, so its stock market tripled in a year. Another exception is energy company stocks. Historical data generally show that during periods of high inflation, energy company stocks perform very well. This aligns well with the global inflation scenario that started in 2022. That's why ExxonMobil has been one of the best performing companies since the beginning of 2022. So, what ultimately causes inflation? You might think it's due to central banks printing money or printing too much money. Well, it's both right and wrong. Sometimes inflation can happen without the government printing money, and sometimes even excessive money printing by the government doesn't lead to inflation. Take the Bank of Japan as an example. Despite printing money in large quantities for over 20 years, Japan still experiences deflation. Now let's look at 3 factors that could cause inflation. The first is demand-pull inflation. Imagine a normally functioning economy where one day, for some reason, everyone really wants to drink milk tea. Everything runs smoothly, but this desire for milk tea now created an additional demand in this economy. Everyone starts going to milk tea shops to buy milk tea. At this point, the owners of all the milk tea shops across the country become very excited. This has 2 consequences. One is producing more milk tea, and the other is an increase in the price of milk tea. Either way, it results in the milk tea shop owners ending up making more money. The owners, now with more earnings, can go buy more food, handbags, and whatnot. If you have generous owners, they might even give bonuses or raise salaries for their employees. Then the employees with more money in hand go buy more food and handbags. At this point, the businesses selling handbags and food start thriving. They now order more handbags and food from the suppliers. So in summary, it starts with an increase in overall demand, leading to higher production and prices. This increases the profits for businesses, which in turn boosts consumption, leading to a new round of demand growth. This positive cycle then takes off. The increase in overall demand leads to economic growth. But you might have noticed a side effect here: rising prices or inflation. So this entire cycle essentially describes demand-pull inflation. We see that demand really can be a driving force for social progress. If a government wanted to stimulate its economy, they would start by stimulating demand, but the side effect is inflation. But what is meant by stimulating the economy? Simply put, it's to motivate people to spend money. It's either the government itself that spends the money, like developing infrastructure or giving out subsidies. But the simpler way is to hand out money directly to the people and let them spend it themselves. For example, when the pandemic first started and everyone was staying at home, who was still drinking milk tea? Demand was weak. That's when governments around the world started running their printing presses. Look at the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England. While stimulating demand, they also injected a large amount of money into the economy, increasing the risk of inflation. That's because inflation and economic growth are a bundled package, like a buy one get one free deal. Although it's a package deal, if you stimulate the economy at just the right time, you can achieve economic growth while minimizing inflation. Now let's suppose the milk tea shop is already idling with plenty of materials on hand. With new customers coming in, it's easy to meet their demand right away. So there's hardly any need to raise the price of milk tea. In this case, you're only increasing GDP, which is nice. On the other hand, imagine if the milk tea shop was already overcrowded. If the government insists on stimulating demand under these circumstances, it can only lead to an increase in the price of milk tea. However, there's no actual increase in production, which is a rather bad situation. So do you see? The biggest difference in these 2 examples is whether the milk tea shop still has some untapped production capacity. Now let's say there's a huge potential for production capacity in the economy. When you pump money into it, what you see is economic growth. You might even feel that no matter how much money you inject, you see economic growth, not rising prices. The economy surges forward, creating great prosperity. So how can the production capacity within an economy be assessed? You can look at the unemployment rate. Think about it. If the unemployment rate is high, it means a lot of people are not working, and there's a lot of untapped production capacity. Conversely, if the unemployment rate is very low, only around 2 to 3%, that would indicate that most of the labor force is already employed. This means that production capacity is very high. This also explains why a period of low unemployment often precedes high inflation. Actually, in Keynesian economics, there's something called the Phillips curve, which describes an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment rates. The explanation is pretty much like this. For example, if we look at the United States now, the unemployment rate has been declining over the past few years, and the number of job vacancies reported has risen to over 10 million. At the same time, corporate profit margins are at a near 60-year high. What does this mean? It means that companies have been making money, and now they want to expand their production and employ more people to earn even more. However, because most people are employed, it's almost impossible to employ more people. Isn't this situation similar to the overcrowded milk tea shop we mentioned earlier? So what do? We increase the price. And there you go, inflation. In situations like these, the Federal Reserve will still continue to use quantitative easing. So it's no wonder that inflation gets so high. Earlier we mentioned that printing money can stimulate demand, which leads to a cycle of economic stimulation and inflation. However, central banks in various countries are facing a rather awkward problem recently. The money they print actually can't be distributed effectively. When it comes to controlling currency, the policies adopted by central banks are essentially either adjusting interest rates or buying and selling financial assets. But in reality, these measures just circulate the money within the financial system. How can this be explained? For example, the central bank purchases a lot of government and corporate bonds, but the financial institutions that sell these bonds and receive the money don't lend it to the real economy. Instead, they might turn around and invest it in the stock market for their own gain. This means that no matter how low the central bank sets interest rates, these commercial banks just don't lend out the money. As a result, no money flows into the real economy. In this way, the money never reaches consumers like us, who could actually use it to buy milk tea. The money printed doesn't enter the economic growth cycle we talked about earlier. This explains to a certain extent why for about 10 years before 2020, places like Japan, Europe, and the United States, despite such extensive quantitative easing and long-term low interest rates, didn't see inflation in the real economy. Instead, we only saw stock markets booming. After the pandemic hit, the Biden administration seemed to understand that central bank money printing was no longer very effective. It was time for the government to step in. They decided to give money directly to the people. In 2020, almost everyone got $1,200, and families with kids got an extra $500. Unemployed people got an extra $600 every month, plus there were breaks on loans. In 2021, people making less than $75,000 a year got another $1,400. Over these 2 years, the government gave out around $5 trillion in debt. This is like every American getting about $15,000 on average. And this approach really worked. The money truly entered the economic growth cycle. Coupled with the previously low unemployment rate, in 2022, the United States then experienced high inflation. Okay, moving on to the second one, which is cost-push inflation. This is also very simple and straightforward. The cause here is the rise in the cost of raw materials, like an increase in oil prices or shortages of food due to natural disasters. Because of these cost increases, profit margins decrease, and companies are forced to raise product prices, which in turn are passed on to consumers. As you see, this kind of price increase is different from the demand pull inflation we talked about earlier. Previously, the increase in milk tea prices was driven by everyone wanting to drink milk tea. But this time, it's different. The demand hasn't changed, but the price of milk tea has now risen. As a result, people will naturally reduce their consumption of milk tea. In other words, the price increase suppresses overall demand, leading everyone to start tightening their belts, which causes economic output to decrease and GDP to fall. So it's clear that this type of cost-push inflation is really terrible. It causes not only inflation, but also hits the economy hard. For the government, it's a very difficult situation with no benefits. Of course, this doesn't apply to companies that sell raw materials or oil. Clearly, the current inflation in Europe and Japan is primarily cost-push inflation. Actually, it's not just Europe and Japan. The global energy crisis affects almost everyone to some extent. However, Since the United States is a major oil-producing country, its impact is relatively smaller. But for Europe and Japan, which are not oil producers, the impact is great. Let's take a look at the inflation rate in Russia since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. The war started in February 2020, and by March 2022, inflation had soared to 16.7%. Why does war lead to inflation? Some might guess it's because Russia is secretly printing money, which leads to inflation. But it usually doesn't happen so quickly. It's not like you go to war one month and face inflation the next. The main reason for inflation in Russia is actually the Western sanctions and the devaluation of the ruble. Think about it. At the beginning of the war, the ruble plummeted by 30%, which means that the cost of imported goods for Russia increased by 30% overnight. Plus, with Western sanctions, many high-tech products became impossible to import, leading to a dramatic drop in supply. And reduced supply and increased prices led to cost-push inflation. The last cause of inflation, and perhaps the most obvious, is excessive money supply. Although we said earlier that stimulating the economy at just the right time might not lead to inflation, everything has its limits. If you keep printing money 24/7, it's bound to cause inflation. Historically, almost all causes of hyperinflation have been caused by governments printing money without any restraints. Spending money as fast as you can print it is definitely not a good strategy, but let's set that aside for now. You might wonder, are those governments stupid? They see such high inflation, so why don't they just pause for a while, control inflation, and then resume printing money for stimulation? Why do we see an endless number of countries with inflation reaching unimaginably high levels? Obviously, there's a vicious cycle at play here, encompassing all three scenarios we discussed: demand, cost, and money supply. The government, even if it wants to, can't stop it. This is actually the most terrifying aspect of inflation. Usually, government prints a lot of money like this during wars or for political reasons. But a government wouldn't resort to such a crude method as printing and spending its own money unless absolutely necessary. We are aware of the consequences, and surely the government is too, right? Take, for example, Germany from 1920 to 1923, and Hungary in 1945 and 1946. These instances of hyperinflation were a result of their defeats in World War I and II. After signing a number of reparation agreements, they were forced to start printing their own money. When the government prints money, the quantity of currency increases, which then drives demand, leading to demand pull inflation. However, because the government prints money excessively, inflation rises too quickly. When inflation reaches a certain level, wealth distribution in society happens very rapidly. This means that people end up just focusing on meeting their basic needs for food and shelter. People never think about saving money in such situations. Note that at this stage, hyperinflation hasn't occurred yet. It's only about 40 to 50%. But even if the government realizes the dangers of inflation at this point and stops the printing presses, people have already reduced their work. As a result, production capacity starts to reduce, and supply of goods declines. Goods become scarce. And what does this lead to? Price increases. This tells us that due to insufficient supply, we're seeing cost-push inflation. Then as inflation gets even higher, people work even less, leading to more scarcity of goods and even higher inflation. And this, at some point, leads to hyperinflation rates as high as 7.5% times 10 to the 170th power. Inflation actually has a very important characteristic, which I've been holding back until now, and that is the expectation of inflation can lead to inflation. This means that if everyone really feels that inflation is coming, then it truly will come. Because everyone expects prices to rise, businesses start to increase prices continuously. Gradually, as prices rise, employers begin to raise salaries, and then everyone has more money in hand. Thus, inflation really happens. But there's another point. In an economy, there's a certain amount of money corresponding to a certain amount of goods. But just because everyone expects inflation to happen, without any government policy stimulation or increase in the total amount of money, why would prices rise? It might be a bit theoretical. Let's think about it for a second. When everyone expects inflation, the money in your hand starts to feel like a hot potato. You will instinctively increase your consumption, or even consider buying extra things in advance, as they might become more expensive later. If everyone in the economy starts thinking like this, then the time money stays in each person's hands becomes shorter. This actually increases the velocity of money circulation. So, when the market expects inflation, the speed at which money circulates increases. Even though the total amount of money remains the same, the amount of money in circulation increases. Once this cycle is started, even if the central bank doesn't print a single penny, inflation can still happen on its own. That's why we see many central banks, when controlling inflation, not only focus on interest rate adjustments and easing policies, but also placed great importance on adjusting people's psychological expectations. That is why the Federal Reserve Chairman appears very calm in public statements. Even in 2021, when inflation had already reached 5%, he still maintained that it was transitory. Then, as inflation data continued to rise month after month, it seemed like a slap in the face. But he remained calm, saying, "We are confident and determined to control this inflation," to show that they have the confidence and determination to push down the market. Now that you understand this, it becomes clear why central banks get so alarmed at high inflation rates. They panic. Look at the US rapidly raising interest rates by 75 basis points multiple times. This definitely had a massive impact on domestic demand, potentially suppressing the demand that the government had just stimulated with spending. So, this should give you a fresh perspective on the global situation. And if you're thinking of working at a central bank in the future, it might be helpful to review this a few times. If you like the content, please leave a like and subscribe. See you in the next one.